this is the webinar showcase from the Placemakers Microcluster Networks project. And this project has been based on a partnership between Charts, Argyll and Isles, and the Innovation School, Glasgow School of Art, through my fellowship, which I'll mention in a bit more, but it also has gained support funding-wise from Creative Scotland and through Charts core funding of Argyll and Bute Council. So essentially the program for today is for me to give you a bit of background and detail about what happened in this project and some of the key outputs and insights of engaging the Charts membership network in this sort of design-led process of mapping and coordinating clusters, or microclusters as we were calling them. And then we'll share the 3 presentations of the funded placemaking projects: Eco Creative Cluster, Take Flight from Soar Collective, and Janine Co's Pop, as we've seen from the people who've introduced themselves. So my fellowship was titled The Value of Creative Growth. And this was an Innovation Leadership Fellowship in the creative digital economy that's been delivered over the last 2.5 years and has finished literally last month. So this is one of those final outputs. Now, the aim of the fellowship was to advance approaches to supporting and evaluating creative growth at that sole trader and micro enterprise level, 1 to 5 people, because such a high proportion of the creative industries is constituted of people and organizations at that scale. It was doing this through design-led practices, developing and testing more relational measures of growth, qualitative measures of growth that better represent the interest and impact of creative work in the context they engage. And the strategy to do this was to do it in partnership with regional network-based organizations who support such creative ecosystems. So alongside working with Charts, there was 2 other projects. One was working in Southwest England, Bristol and Bath, with the University of Western England, Bristol, and a network of 4 cultural hubs who are supporting and developing creative entrepreneurs. And I would sort of part of that support package, offering mapping approaches and then evaluating the program. And another project closer to home in Dundee was about regrowing digital arts. This was sort of in the context of the pandemic, using the sort of model and mapping approaches I'm about to share to review the past successes and past activities of Neon, who are a digital arts festival and network, to inform their regrowth and re-emergence going forward. So very much a strategic development and recruiting sort of different artists in their network to shape some of that future. But here we're talking about the microcluster networks in Argyll and Isles that has been running for the last 1.5 years. So underpinning the research and the fellowship has been a trajectory of AHRC funded design research, developing an actor network mapping methodology. So this model, called the creative growth model, essentially is like a network mapping model. So each of those axes, culture, social, practice, and economic, try and represent the different interests of different actors or stakeholders in creative work. And that's used to frame the different relationships of growth that can form qualitatively. So between social and cultural interest, there's a community of practice, there's a growth of network of people being brought together around that work. Between social and practice, it's more about the know-how, the knowledge growth that can occur, which can be skills-based, it can be building on historical work, and it can be experimental work with new materials, essentially that growth in knowledge and capacity. On the economic side, in practice, that's producing outputs, that's producing value. So that can be products, services, and experiences, but it can also be narratives, it can be models and ways of working, and it can be impacts in wider context as well, and understanding those impacts. And then in the top right, sort of between culture and economic is more the market framing, the who for question, which obviously in creative work isn't just an economic market, but one that's much broader and of constituents to get involved in creative work. And aligned with that, in the text in the bottom left, I've been using this evaluation framework to help sort of shape it, to help tell rich qualitative stories of creative growth. So particularly looking at the changes and outcomes that happens in projects, that's those forward steps based on the aims and the results that come from the work. The changes in process, that's the sideways steps or adaptations that happen within that work. As you're learning how to do it, you may change how you do it to achieve those aims. And then thirdly, the contextual factors, that learning in context that affects those 2 dimensions of making forward steps or making the sideways steps you need. And that aims to support what I call developmental evaluation, an ongoing process of shared learning across everyone based on those aims and development needs. So the shape of the partnership essentially looked like this. We started with a scoping process, which really collaborated with the steering group to really shape the design of the program. Then there was a parallel series of sessions of the one-to-one mapping sessions Kathleen was mentioning. I'll go into all of these in a bit more detail in the next few slides, alongside some themed engagement. So on one side, it was the individual understanding of what was motivating creative work and how they understood their context. And the other one was ways of bringing people together in shared dialogue under topics that we felt would be important for everyone to gather under. And then finally, this all helped inform the Placemakers project, where we funded 3 projects that are going to be presented today based on some of these principles, and basically supporting them, seeing how growth can happen in this sort of collaborative model. And underpinning that through the project was a process developmental evaluation, essentially giving plenty of opportunities to come back together to reflect and understand what change is happening, what difference is being made, what values are we seeing, so that it can constantly inform the information at the next stage. So the scoping work essentially was to help frame the co-design of the program. This was a mapping workshop with the working group, steering group, and interviews with them that helped frame 4 broad aims that wanted to be achieved with charts, developing that kind of reflect the model in some way, to develop opportunities through network building, connecting member activities, to support creative entrepreneurial development of individuals, organizations, and collaborations, to actively promote the creative culture and heritage in Argyll and the Isles, and to develop expertise, resource, and a clear role for charts going forward. So those one-to-one mapping sessions were called Mapping Your Creative Growth. And essentially these mapping templates developed from the model were designed and applied in one-to-one online sessions using Zoom and Miro, a visualization software that you can collaborate remotely on, and taking them through 3 forms of mapping and reflection. One was called narrative mapping, very much a profiling of the values and the motivations of their creative work. The network mapping, which was then sort of seeing from a creative growth challenge in the center, as in what's the next thing you want to be doing, basically mapping out a list of options, actors, and interests, and in order to frame lots of possibility and opportunities going forward. And then the third mapping session was trajectory mapping, essentially a visual action plan using the insights from the first 2 maps to then frame growth using a vision of 3 to 5 years. Overall, there was 32 mapping sessions delivered across a 6-month period, each lasting at least 2.5 hours, with 37 different participants, because some did it in pairs or groups representing organizations, representing 80 hours of direct support and producing 96 maps, which continues to be a resource for charts to re-engage and understand. So these maps were useful for the individual members, but also became data, essentially to understand strategically what the motivations of Argyll and Isles are. And this geographic map shows the spread of those who took part, which we're very pleased was very even spread across mainland and islands. So most areas were represented. Key insights from that, we derived a list of about 12 categories for creative growth. These were the things motivating growth across these this membership. And we feel together they articulate a particular representation of Argyll and Bute as a region for creative activity. And so with that, alongside the insights below, these can be used to build arguments for collaborative development and investment in these areas. So these are more sort of signposting to say, here's where a lot of really interesting thing in human capital is. But other insights to share, there was a clear split across the membership between enterprise-driven and inquiry-driven members. That is, those who had an organization they were responsible for economically, and those who were very much driven by practice. And that split, there was only 4 who could have been argued to balance both. So this represents one of those challenges for charts to meaningfully represent and communicate with such different mindsets. And this is where the microcluster approach is positioned to find a way to bring them more together, to align their skill sets and align these mindsets in different new ways. The adaptation to the pandemic context using online visualization and meeting platforms was argued to enable much greater reach than would have been achieved otherwise, particularly for a region like Argyll and Bute. If I'd been doing these as sessions in physical places, I would not have reached some of the islands and some of the communities that I did. The potential growth for work and collaboration is there to explore coastal cultures. This was one of the headline themes, and it's not a surprise, but it was too obvious not to mention. that there was a lot of really world-class quality work and interesting work going on about coastlines, both on islands and mainland. So this was seen as something to highlight and mention as something strategic to look at going forward. There was a strong belief, this connects to the theme of advocacy for creative work, in the role of creativity for local culture in Argyll and Bute, and particularly for practitioners and visitors and communities, that it has a role to enable a sense of belonging that can be really authentic and really meaningful and part of community building. Each contributor gained bespoke forms of validity by mapping into their wider ecosystem. And I mention this because that idea of validity is a really important part of building confidence in practitioners, which is such a key trait and such a key reason that in the final point, Charts is there to facilitate connections and sustain dialogue within, between and beyond Argyll and Bute, because it is in our relationship with the wider ecosystem that confidence and development is most effective. Oops. There we go. So just touching on the themed engagement, there was 5 themes that were co-developed with the steering group and delivered through September and November of last year as webinars, workshops, and a bit of social media engagement. Overall, this also used funding from Creative Scotland and the Create Networks fund to allow us to pay for contributors from across the membership, share their work, share their experience under these themes, and be part of dialogues. Overall, there were 65 webinar participants and 72 workshop participants, reaching overall 137. And in the workshops, this supported 26 ideas. Now, this was framed alongside the Placemakers Fund that the 3 projects being presented were awarded. And there are also 5 archived videos that are still available as a resource for ongoing learning. And I highly recommend anyone here can go back and look at those and see what stories and insights were shared. So with wider insights, working with the members as co-curators was essential to translate these themes as something relevant to the membership, inviting people along and how these themes can communicate and mean something across the cohort. In the discussions and the presentations, there was a very reflective, honest tone, and this helped to facilitate meaningful connections and validation, particularly in the time of the pandemic, where a lot of people were having to adapt and adjust. Being able to talk about how they're thinking about it was highly, highly valuable. As a result, this is argued to have facilitated an arena for critical exchange, a way of recognizing and reifying that all constituents are entitled to come together as something that can add value to their practice, and that there is value in facilitating collective dialogue around funding opportunities, as we did for this Placemakers Fund. This was seen as something that Charts can really line up, accessing fund, but initiating dialogues, webinars, and conversations that can really facilitate quality proposals and quality connections in the process. I won't go into too much details about the Placemakers projects because they're here to tell the stories themselves, but I will signpost you to the report that does use the model and that evaluation framework of progress adaptation and learning, just to give you a deeper insight into how growth looked and felt for projects like this. So I recommend do looking at that, but we're going to get a rich, rich story being told to us later today. But what I will share is that we did do a co-evaluation process that tried to understand what was emerging of value from these projects. And so what is positioned in the report are these 4 evaluative themes with some supportive questions that aim to help tell the story of much more socio-cultural development and value in such placemaking projects. And the 4 themes aim to essentially be a chronological sort of building blocks for richer and richer stories. The first one, bringing people together, really articulating the reasons and why people do get energized and get attracted to creative and cultural work and assets. Can you tell that story? Can you tell the story of what impact that has for them? Then the values of community growth is really looking at when you bring people together in this way, what new things, what exciting things are happening, what kinds of dialogue, what kind of new perspectives are being brought together. The third theme, open-ended progressive practices, really highlights the role of creative practitioners in that process and how they identify best practice for doing those aspects really well, recognizing that value, being transparent in their process, and understanding how others can access, learn, and validate from your work. And then finally, placemaking as brokering is almost taking it to that strategic level, telling that story of how your understanding the value of the work you do helps you broker more opportunities to build on that value set. And this is all very qualitative. And so it's all about storytelling based on these keen insights, hopefully. So this is intended as a resource to help the profiling and evaluation and the storytelling of many projects like this going forward for charts and Argyll and Isles. So finally, there's a re-summary of recommendations that go into more detail in the report, but essentially it's recognizing that charts would like to co-develop opportunities for leadership with members across regions and sectors. This is recognizing the valuable role the steering group played as leaders and engaging in some of these challenging contexts and providing some opportunities through that. The microcluster process can provide a model for developing arenas. This is spaces for critical exchange across different field voices and purposeful peer dialogues. And so we see this in the projects here, but also in some of the processes of the themed engagement as well. The organization, production, and curation of cultural knowledge is a shared responsibility. This addressed and acknowledged the challenge that the visibility of creative and cultural work across Argyll and Isles is sometimes limited. And that is partly because on a siloed individual basis, micro-organizations struggle to have the resource to effectively tell stories. And therefore, we see this as something that should be strategically part of building the network, sharing platforms and sharing ways to tell meaningful, effective stories. And that responsibility should be at partnership level right from the beginning. We feel that we can celebrate and integrate the region's diversity of actors in a broad range of situations. This is that idea that when you open up beyond the institutions to allow leadership from practitioners, as for example has happened in these placemaking projects, much more sort of sustainable and valuable work can happen. The institutions can still retain an anchoring role, someone who can really effectively facilitate knowledge and resource, but the growth and the community growth and reaching new communities and audiences is about supporting the wider actors to build those relationships and practitioners. And finally, placemaking is emerging as a process and practices to develop situated notions of value. So for example, those themes there aim to try and tell those bespoke stories, those nuanced stories specific to a place, and give you a way to articulate them to funders, to decision makers, to wider audiences. And this is partly what we hope will shape some of the work for charts going forward. So I'll welcome any questions or comments to be addressed at the end with a panel discussion. Otherwise, I'm going to stop sharing screen. Thank you all for listening, and I'm going to pass on now to Deborah and Naoko for their presentation of the Eco Creatives Cluster.
Take a moment.